All right, so let's go ahead and get started with our demo for today. Now that we are sudoers, now we can execute all the commands that we need. So let me go ahead and close that. So how can I verify that I am in the sudo group? We're gonna run the command from the slides, get ent group. We're gonna specify. We're gonna get some information on the group. We got to give the group name. It's gonna be sudo. And as you can see there, VBox user is part of the sudoers group. It's usually what goes after this last colon is going to be a list of all the users. So if I had more than one user, it'd be VBox user, comma, and then whatever users are also sudoers. So there we go. We have verified that we are indeed part of the sudo group. So now we can execute as many sudo commands as we want. You can also, just for your knowledge, you can also limit what commands a sudoer can run. We're not going to cover that in this class, but if you run sudo-l, you'll see that kind of the subset of commands that a sudoer can run. So by default, if you don't make changes, it's going to be able to run all the same commands that a root user can run. Sorry. So yeah, if a root user can, for example, add new users, and then the sudoers have access to all the permissions, then they're also going to be able to do the same things, as you'll be able to see in these next few commands for the demo. So remember, sudo, just a good way to access root privileges in a safer way, a controlled way. We say controlled because you can actually manage, right, who has sudo access. You can tell which usernames will belong to the sudo group, as we just did in the previous part of this demo. Versus the root user, right, where if you kind of just give somebody the root user password, then you really can't manage what they do. You can't limit their permissions. And of course, as we saw in the slides, there are no security logs for root user. So if a sudoer is doing, certain operations, you can actually look at the security logs to see what they were up to. Now, if you're a root user, you're kind of hidden, right? Because you have these elevated privileges, no one's keeping track of you. There are no security logs by default. So yeah, important in a professional environment, right? If you're working in a business system, you're probably going to want to run as sudo and not as root. So yeah, sudo gives us the same privileges though, pretty much, as a root user. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to go ahead and add some groups, add some users, and that's going to show us that it'll give us access to previously, limited permissions by managing our users and groups effectively. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a new user. So now there are two commands for adding new users. There's the sudo user add, which is more limited in scope, and then there's this sudo add user. So why are there two? So add user is actually a package that somebody created where they pretty much put a lot of the user add commands together in one, so that you don't have to run 10 different commands to do one addition of a user, right? If you want to create a new user, it kind of packages all the commands in one. You'll see once it gives us some prompts, all the different commands that it's adding. So when I do a sudo add user, and then I have to give it a username, so let's do student. So adding new user student, they added a group called student, they created a home directory at home/student, and they even copied some files that we need. And in addition to that, it's going to have us set the password. So typically this would require many different user add commands. By using the add user, you kind of skip a lot of that stuff. You do it all at once, essentially. Now, if your add user command shows up as invalid, make sure to look at the slide for how to install the add user. It's going to be the apt install. If you're on a Fedora system, it's slightly different installation command. Whenever you're typing in commands, whenever you're troubleshooting, I highly recommend that you always use ChatGPT. So something I want to bring up. Whenever you're stuck with a particular command and you don't know what to, do in a certain situation, maybe you're stuck. maybe what I show right isn't working, you can always go with ChatGPT. So you can always go like, oh, how to install add user in a Fedora um, Linux machine. And there it is. It tells you the command on how to install add user. And then you could even do how to do in an Ubuntu machine, which I do put in the slides. I do describe which command to for installing it. So typically in Ubuntu, add user should be pre-installed. But like I said, everyone configured their VM slightly differently. Maybe different versions, maybe different image entirely. You can run the sudo apt install add user if you get any invalid command on there. So yeah, add user is kind of an extra package. We will be covering how to install packages in the following weeks. Packages is essentially like adding new apps, right, to your computer. You can do the same thing with command line, where there's packages that help you do things in the command line directly. So yeah, remember chatgpt.com, huge resource for command line. Back in the day, most people had to memorize this stuff. Now, as long as you have a basic understanding of command line, you can do a lot with the help of ChatGPT. So something I highly encourage you use, not just for this lab, for the following labs as well, and for your final project when we do some cool stuff in the command line. Definitely don't do it alone. Always use some help, because the truth is most people are using this in their day-to-day workflow. All right, so let's go ahead and type in the new password. They do have some password requirements. It can't be like, plain English words. It has to be 8 characters long. I'm just gonna go with QWERTY on my keyboard, and then 1, 2, 3. Oh, it doesn't pass. So I'm gonna do QWER 1, 2, 3, 4. QWER 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. QWER 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, just try different passwords. If it denies the password there, for full name, I'm gonna put William B. Room number, we're gonna say 112 for CIS 112. Work phone, we're gonna skip that. Home phone, I skip it just by hitting enter. I don't type anything. Is the information correct? Yes. If I hit no, it's gonna have me enter it again. And just like that, I have a new user called student. I can verify that their home directory was created by doing a pwd tilde and then type in the user's name, student. And there you can see, now that should have said /student. Let's see. Let's check that it is existing real quick. Oops, sorry, wrong command. So this essentially read the first tilde and did this. Didn't read the student part. If you want to see where the student directory is, you actually have to do an echo, because this is a variable. We'll talk about variables in the following weeks as well, kind of how to set them and how they're useful. So just do an echo tilde student, and there we go. We have a /home/student. So that's a new directory. This directory does belong to the student user. So the student user is the owner. That's their level of permissions. There's also a group that's automatically created, as you can see here on the add user output. They did create a new group called student. So this belongs to the student user, which has all the permissions, and then also the student group, which should also have all the same permissions by default. We're not going to verify that though. We can certainly log out, close the VM, and then log in as a student, and we could see, right, I should be able to create files in home/student. I should be able to make new directories, for example. Again, you don't really need sudo for that. The only reason we needed sudo here is because we created a brand spanking new student, or user, I should say. Alright, so what if I wanted VBox user to have access to the student files? Because, for example, if I do ls/home/student, I'm going to get a permission denied. That's not by accident. I'm VBox user. I don't have access to student. That's a different user. We're separating, right, those users, and we're protecting those files via the permissions, the users, and the groups. So we're going to have to run a few commands in order to give VBox user access to the home/student. Remember though, if you do sudo student, it does print out what's in home/student. So now there's nothing there, so we're gonna add some stuff first before we go ahead and start making changes. So we're gonna do sudo mkdir/home/student/ we're gonna call it my files, or we'll call it student files. Just get the point across. I was able to make a directory with sudo. If I didn't use sudo, I would get a permission denied. Because remember, we're currently, if I run a who am I'm currently VBox user. I don't have permissions to do stuff on the home/student. Only student does. Remember, right, you could close the VM, log in as student, and then make the directory. But right, that's not the point of this lesson. The point is, how can we give other users, right, permissions to other groups? So we're going to do that with some of the following commands. Before we do that though, just like we made a directory, let's go ahead and add a file there. So we're going to do sudo touch home/student/student files, and then we're going to do keys.txt. And remember, because I put sudo in front, I was able to do that. If I did that without sudo, a couple of shortcuts that are going to be useful now that we're entering the latter part of the class. If you have a home key on your keyboard, home key takes you to the beginning of the command, so you don't have to use your arrow keys to cycle through. So home key will take you to the beginning, end key will take you to the end. Backspace right, to delete in this direction. If you do delete key, it's going to delete in the right direction. Just like I did there by going first home and then hitting delete. So remember, home and end, quick ways to get to the beginning and end of your command. Alright, so I already created the command there. I'm going to show you that if I try to do that without sudo, I'm going to get permission denied. Because again, I'm currently VBox user. VBox user is not part of the student group. It's not part of any group that has permissions over the student file. So we're going to fix that in some of the following commands. Alright, so how can we fix this permissions issue? Well, that's all about groups and ownership, right? So right now there is only one owner of the home/student, and that's the student user. That's fine, we're not going to mess with that. Another way to give ourselves permissions is through groups, right? So we're going to create a group that's going to then have permissions over those student files, and then we're going to add ourselves to that group. We'll do that step by step and explain as we go. So first we need to create a group. So we're going to do sudo group add, as we saw in the slides. This is going to add a new group. We're going to call it class, right? Because we're working with students in this example. So sudo group add class. Remember, if we're going to be doing operations like group add, user mod, add user, we're going to need that sudo in front of it because we're messing with the system. Alright, so sudo group add class. There's now a group called class. Currently there are no users there, so we need to fix that. We're going to do a sudo user mod. We're going to modify our current user. Remember, if you want to verify who you are, you do a who am I. We're going to do a sudo user mod. And if we're going to add ourselves to a group, we're going to use the A flag and we're going to use the capital G. Together, they're going to add a user to a group without messing with any of the user's pre-existing groups. Why would you do another command where it would mess with the pre-existing groups? Maybe you want to destroy those groups, right? But for the most part, people who are adding a user to the group will always use the -AG flag. It's kind of the most useful one, right? If you don't want to mess with the user's previous groups. VBox user, for example, is probably part of the VBox user group, and we don't want to mess with that. Alright, so let's see. Sudo user mod -AG. We need to tell it the group. Remember when we added sudoers, we put sudo here. We're going to add the new group we just created, which is class. And then again, we need to provide the username, just like we did for sudoers. we got to tell it, hey, add VBox user to the class group. And just like that, VBox user is part of the class group. Now, we still don't have permissions. If we do a special ls, it's a good idea to do sudo in front, ls-ld is going to list the files, and it's going to add a lot of detail to those listings. We do home/student. We can see who owns this particular, or who has permissions over this directory. Right now it's just the student, user, and the student group. Right? We still haven't given the class, this new class group, permission over the home/student. So we're going to fix that. We're going to fix that with two commands. We're going to do a sudo chown. Chown is going to change the ownership, right? We got to change the owners of the home/student directory to add the class group as part of the owners. So you could do VBox user, you could do first the username and then the group, which would be class. Or you could you could just do :class, and that'll apply to all the users in the class group. So it's usually useful, right, if you do want to apply the permissions to the entire group, in this case the entire class group, you could just do : and leave the user empty. So we're going to do :class, and then we're going to say which directory, right, we want to modify the permissions for. Well, of course, we want to give the entire class access over this student's directory, which is home/student. You could do a slash at the end, or you could leave it like that. It does the same thing. Alright, so now the class group is owners over home/student. And if you do a sudo ls-ld, you can see now the class group is the owner over the home/student. Alright, so let's go ahead and give the class permissions, the right permissions, right, over this student directory, right, the student home directory. Because right now class might not have any permissions, right? It might be a 0. Remember, there's the 7, the 5, the 4, the 0, the different numbers that tell us, right, what permissions a particular directory or file has. If we're going to modify those permissions, we got to use a chmod. So that's going to set the level, right, of access that the class group has. So we're going to do sudo chmod-r. R is going to be so it applies to everything in that directory, subdirectories, files inside those subdirectories. So always a good idea to put the -r in front of the command, or I should say in front of the arguments, as we did in the chown, right? I did do a -r. Alright, so we're going to do a chmod. So remember, the user should always, for the most part, the owner should have the highest permissions, which is a 7. In this case, the second number, right, in every case, is going to apply to the group. For our particular situation, I do want to give the group the maximum permissions. I want class to do everything that student can do on home/student. So I'm going to also give it a 7. Remember, 7 is the highest permissions. And then for anybody else that's not part of the group and not part of the ownership of the main owner, I'm going to give them a 0. So I'm going to keep them locked out of home/student. And of course, if I'm going to apply this to home/student, I need to put that in the argument for this command. And just like that, now the class should have the highest permissions, because that middle number is for groups. Class is a group, so now it's given the 7, which is the highest permissions: read, write, and execute. For now, we only need to worry about read and write. Read means see the files. Write means modify the files. Execute, that's going to be later on once we get to scripts. Alright, so there is one more step. These changes aren't going to be active until we actually reboot the system. Just like we had a reboot for sudo, you do need to reboot in order to make these changes become active. You could do the machine reset. You could do that from either your machine tab here, or you could go to your VBox user, right, and then right-click reset. There is another option. You could log into the group, and it'll kind of refresh everything. I think it's new grp, and then you do class. and then that will log you into the class group. But we're not going to do any of that. We're just going to keep it, old fashioned. We're just going to do a sudo reboot. This will actually do the same thing as resetting your machine. The reason we have to do this extra command, this extra reboot, there is the alternative, right, of the new group login, which we don't cover in the slides, which is why we're not going to use that one. Sudo reboot is going to reset the system because anytime you modify the users in the groups, you're going to have to do a reboot to make those changes become active. So we're going to do sudo reboot because we like to do everything from command line. We no longer need our GUI, right? We're going to move further and further away from GUI and more into command line as we go further in the class. And you'll see that even though command line is a little bit intimidating, right, it is fast. You can do things very, very quickly. And notice there is a new user, right, when I log in called William B. They are the student user. So I could definitely log in as William B, but we're not going to do that because I want to show you that previously at the beginning, VBox user didn't have any permissions. Typing in the password wrong. VBox user didn't have any permissions over home/student. But now that we've rebooted our system, we've made those permission changes, we've done all that cool stuff in the command line, I should now have permissions over home/student, even though I wasn't originally the owner. So let's go ahead and execute some commands to verify that. Alright, so if you remember, if we did an ls/home/student, it gave us a permission denied, right? Of course, if we do sudo in front, we don't have to worry about permissions. It's always going to list things, right? But if I don't put sudo in front, then I have to make sure I have the right permissions to do these things. Last time this gave us a permission denied, just to verify, right, who am I, VBox user. You can also see it right here in the bash prompt, right? It does have our username. You don't actually have to run who am I. But yeah, I am VBox user. Last time this gave me permission denied. This time, I now have access. And because I have the highest access, a 7, because we did that through the chmod, right? We set 7, and then the second number, which is for groups, also a 7. Now I have permission to do whatever I want in home/student. So let's go ahead and let's create a file in home/student. So first let me clear if you want to declutter, right, your console, you can always run a clear. And let's go ahead and make some modifications without sudo this time, right? Because we don't need sudo now that we set the right permissions. Alright, so we already proved that we had read permissions, right? Because we ran ls/home/student. Now let's prove that we have write permissions, right? That we can actually create files, modify them, and so forth. That's part of the write permission. So naturally, a good way to test that is through the touch command. So we're going to create a file. First, let me verify ls/home/student. Remember, if you already typed in a command, you could just go with your arrow keys to find the old command. So I'm going to create it in student file. So I'm going to do touch home/student/student files. And I'm going to create, let's say, new file.txt. And then if we want to verify, we're going to do an ls/home/student/student files. I'm going to do my home key to quickly navigate to the beginning command, and I'm going to do an ls. And there, yeah, we see new file.txt. So I do, in fact, now have write permissions. And if you remember, we couldn't even read into this directory before. We couldn't even list the files without sudo. So we have indeed successfully given ourselves permissions over the home/student, even though we weren't a student ourselves. We did that through the class group, if you remember. We changed the ownership for this directory to the class group using chown. And then, of course, we had to set the right permission levels to that group, so we did a chmod. Just to remind you about the chmod, if you do a sudo chmod, and then we do a 7, remember 7 is for the main student user. The second number is for the class. So if I do a sudo, for example, chmod, and then I give it, and don't forget your R flag, 700, I'm going to now give the group no permissions. So now the class group is going to be downgraded to a 0 permission. So let's see what that would do. So sudo chmod-r77, I got to give it the directory I want to work with. And now if I try to do, for example, the ls home/student, I no longer have permission. I can't do the touch either because I no longer have permission. I downgraded myself from that 7 down to a 0. Because remember, VBox user, I can do a get ent group, and then we'll do class. VBox user was part of the class group. Class group permission levels are set through the chmod numbers. Remember, the second number is for the group. If you downgrade it to 0, boom, you have now locked out class from doing anything right with home/student. If we upgrade it back to the 7 right, then we'll have those read-write permissions. If you notice that your permissions aren't working, you probably need to do a sudo reboot to make those changes active. So yeah, that's it for this demo. Should be everything you need for the lab. We'll cover that in the next video.